African-American journalist Terrell Jermaine Starr sees the story of Ukrainian resilience as a black experience. Russia is not only a colonial state, but it's also a supremacist state, he says. Terrell has made it his mission to build bridges of trust between Americans and Ukraine. This is clearly vital as he explains that African Americans are some of the most exposed people to Russian propaganda and disinformation within the US. Today, we'll be exploring the parallels to discrimination faced by black people in the US with centuries long persecution of Ukrainian identity by the Russian Empire. Terrell Jermaine Starr is the host and founder of Black Diplomat's official YouTube channel, where he posts regular dispatches from Ukraine that feature underrepresented voices and share how civilians are living through the war. Terrell was in Ukraine when the war broke out and provided daily video reports via Twitter that generated millions of views and dozens of appearances on network television, where he spoke to millions of people around the world. Before Terrell focused on Ukraine full-time, he reported for various black-owned and run media outlets in the US, including The Root, where he was a national correspondent and covered presidential, state, and local politics. He has a master's degree in Russian, Eastern European, and Eurasian studies, and a second degree in journalism. Welcome to Silicon Curtain. At the end of the video, if you appreciate the materials, please definitely hit the like button and check you are subscribed so you don't miss any of our fantastic guests and speakers. Thank you also to everybody who supports the work we do by buying me a coffee or becoming a patron, and an especial thanks as well to those who have generously supported our documentary film project to help to get it to the first stage of funding. Thank you so much for that, and I look forward to sharing the results of that project with the audience soon. And we do post updates on the community pages on a regular, near daily basis. Well, you've lived, traveled, and reported on events in Ukraine. And of course, what's happening in Ukraine is, I think we would argue, of world-shattering significance. But that comes after a period of what could be described as historical amnesia. The territory and character of Ukraine has been obscured, covered up, forgotten almost by the wider world until 2022. How did that happen? How did the world essentially forget about Ukraine?
Because once Ukraine held and the war didn't end in 3 days, or this country didn't fall in a week, I think the narrative was wrapped around will Kiev hold, and once it did, the next storyline was what's next, right? And in people's minds, because Kiev didn't fall for them, I think we condition people to feel that the urgency of supporting Ukraine uh, should not have intensified, when in fact the media coverage should have created a narrative around what Russia did outside of Kiev, and the heroic reaction was one that people were clinging on to. And it's something in people's minds about, if the capital doesn't fall, then we may not be 100% good, but the worst is over, when in fact the worst was yet to come. And so that has a lot to do with it. I think a lot of it too is like any news subject. After a few months or a few weeks even, people get fatigued and they move on to the next thing. And that has a lot to do with the internet and how that has conditioned us to move from one breaking news source to the other. And at least from the American context, people get tired of war. You have to remember that the last time that America really has experienced any war on this country was during the Civil War, right? You have to go back to 18, um, you got to like the late 1800s on that. And so we don't know what it's like to be a Pole that's bordering a country that's experiencing a ongoing invasion, or even a German or even a British person who is maybe just a flight or so away from this conflict, where as in America we have two oceans, that has a lot to do with
That's it. And people may have stories from their grandparents who might have been in Normandy or fighting in Europe, but that still certainly feels there's a certain disconnection there. Whereas, I could have conversations with my grandparents who lived in the Blitz, and walking around London, you still see the scars on buildings of where bombs exploded. And you may even have an awareness of where there might have been, a great building or a cultural institution that was gutted and destroyed in the war. So I think we're slightly closer to that psychologically and historically. And it's terrifying, isn't it, in some ways, because if Kiev had fallen, then the Russian narratives, which to an extent were diminished about, Ukraine not being a genuine country, Ukrainians not being a genuine nationality, the Ukrainian language not being separate from Russian, if Kiev had fallen, then these narratives perhaps would have held sway, certainly in the minds of people abroad. Ukraine perhaps was
it.
very close to once again this erasure or historical amnesia taking hold of the narrative.
No, that hasn't happened at all. And so much of the way that Russia talks about Ukraine is that it doesn't exist at all. It's a breakaway region from Russia that never should have had its sovereignty. And so that is the way that Russia has viewed all the countries that it formed, that it colonized. Even after 1991, when the USSR was dissolved, Russia always felt that it needed some type of control over all of those countries, particularly in the case of Ukraine, because they consider Ukraine to be a part of the cornerstone of Russian civilization. And now, when we talk about Kiev and Rus, that's something that Ukrainians take with great pride to say that we are the cradle of. Like the Russians are the ribs of us, and as some would probably argue. But the thing with what the Russians do is say that they take this very ahistorical approach to say that Ukraine co-opted a piece of our territory that belongs to us, and the Ukrainians named themselves something in defiance of where they originally came from. So what the Soviet Union did in all of its damaging years as an occupying force is that we never really learned to understand Ukraine as a sovereign nation until 1991. And even in the academy, when you have degrees like mine from graduate school, Russian, East European and Eurasian Studies, it's led by Russia and then Eastern Europe and then everyone else. And so for a little more than 30 years, Ukraine and other countries have had to navigate what it's like to have their own sovereignty. Mind you, they've had hundreds of years of Russian colonialism via culture, via language that tried to erase that's tried to erase their identity that way. And so the Ukrainians aren't the only people who've experienced this erasure. You in the West, we erased them. We've erased them for decades after the USSR fell by simply not spelling Kyiv properly. Even the AP, it took them a while to spell Kyiv, Kyiv, as opposed to Kiev. And, you have to be really arrogant to tell a group of people that the way that you spell your own country is wrong. But that's what the West did to Ukraine. And so you also have to remember too that the degree granting programs like mine from graduate school also were started by Russianists. These were people who believed in the fidelity of the Russian colonial mind, right? Even though during the Cold War, the West was actively fighting against it, there was a fidelity. There was this belief that the Russia that we thought that we knew would grow into this beacon of post-communist democracy, and we know that that was not the case. And so, in addition to the Ukrainians decolonizing their own minds with this war that first started in 2014 and then became an even bigger war in 2022 taught us, is that the West, we need to decolonize what the Russian Empire, what the Soviet Union, and what the subsequent Russian Federation has been instilling in our mind about what they think Ukrainians are.
And you've been living, working, and reporting on Ukraine for the last 12 plus years, but not just, I think, because it's an interesting place and interesting people. I think you've expressed that it's a sort of laboratory where you can actually explore these concepts of colonialism and imperialism at first hand. Um, I'd love to describe, how you came to that realization and, what you have learned from this extensive immersion into Ukraine and, of course, its aggressive neighbor.
Yeah, so I look at Ukraine as a laboratory of fighting of colonization, and much of how I have come to understand Ukraine through its lens of fighting colonialism is through my experience as a Black American man living in Ukraine, because the way that Ukrainians interact with me on a personal level is just very different from how they communicate with other non-Black people, quite frankly. And so what I get with the Ukrainians is we understand you will understand us because of the racism that you experience and the anti-blackness that you and your people went through in the United States. And so you can't learn that in the history book. There's no pedagogy in particular in traditional universities and colleges that can replace the experience of just living in the country like I have and talking to the Ukrainian people and relating with them on that level. When I was in Lviv back in 2010, just a regular day walking down the street in downtown, an old Ukrainian man walked up to me. I was with a group of maybe 30 colleagues. He waded through the crowd, came to me and said, "Hey, do you want to know the history of our country?" Now, mind you, that is a very broad question, and that you just randomly ask someone on the street. I said, "Yes, sure." And then his first words he said to me were, "Ukraine is a colony of Moscow, and Putin wants to enslave us." And so he just went on and on and on about how Russia wants to enslave Ukraine. And then after a while, one of my colleagues politely pulled me along. But I believe that that man walked through that crowd, through my colleagues, and came directly to me because I was Black. And he felt that in that moment, he had an opportunity to talk about Ukraine with someone who he believed would understand him. Because he could have chosen any of my other colleagues, but he came directly to me. And I've had a number of these conversations in various ways. And so when you talk about the laboratory, I think that if we want to be good stewards of humanity, then, which I do, I think that finding those commonalities of what does it mean to fight oppression are essential, because then we can all come together and be stronger to be in support of one another. And that's really the spirit of my work. It's not just being some reporter from, you can name whatever Western media outlet there is. But the spirit of my work is, after you read my commentary, after you see my on the ground reporting, I want you to understand how you could be a better steward for Ukraine. And I want Ukrainians to learn how they can be better stewards to other oppressed peoples who are not Ukrainians. Because that's the one way that we can destroy these various colonial supremacist beasts in the world, is that they all have one thing in common, which is they want to oppress. They may oppress different people. In America, it was anti-blackness, it's white supremacy. And on the continent of Africa, it's European colonialism. In Russia, it's their lens is a Russian supremacist sphere. And that is its own. You can go to China with the Uyghurs, and it goes on and on and on. And so once oppressed peoples are able to really appreciate that this oppressive structure doesn't benefit any of us, then we will learn not to aid and abet oppression that benefits us. And so in closing, it's like thinking about the Ukrainian. They are oppressed in Russia. When they come into America, they're white. My number one lesson is do not integrate into whiteness. Do not integrate into the type of whiteness that produces anti-blackness, right? And that can be applied to any other groups of people. And so that's what the laboratory has been for me. And it's been really fascinating. And the Ukrainians with whom I communicate have been pretty receptive to it. Now, obviously, there are a lot of challenges, a lot of uncomfortable conversations that come along with that. But I think that they're worthwhile to have if our main goal is to be better stewards to humanity and to one another.
And it's interesting, isn't it? Because, rightly there are people in the US and especially the UK who have been reassessing the legacy of imperialism, the negative legacies of imperialism. And so we've come to see these narratives about oppression in a very much a sort of racial and skin color way. So, it's white suppressing, would be Latinos, African Americans, etc. And in some ways, I think that's been a block to us seeing the sort of tiers of oppression that exist in Russia, where you have a supremacist ethnic Russian culture, or where you have appropriation of various cultures that is relabeled as a Russian imperial culture. And we tend not to see the oppression that goes on there against, Georgians, Ukrainians, and the hundreds of minorities that exist within Russia, because, they're from a shade of white through to sort of, slightly sort of darker skin. We tend not to see that in the same kind of narrative. But it's absolutely another form of colonial impression and an extremely inefficient and brutish kind as well, if you look at the history of the Soviet Union and the Russian Empire before it.
Oh, absolutely. So one of the things that I talk about when I discuss Russian imperialism is Siberia. Siberia is not indigenous Russian land. Okay. So if Russia was indigenous to its people, its landmass, it may be one third of itself. People don't recognize that. At the start of this war, of this second invasion, you could go to the local hospitals and look at the last names of the Russian wounded, and it would be people from the southern regions of Russia. And their last names are particularly distinct from those of, the quote unquote traditional, what we consider to be the stereotypical Russian, right? But the indigenous minorities are overrepresented in those who are mobilized to fight in this invasion. And the Moscow Times has done extensive reporting on this. And it's really a narrative that is germane to any imperial or colonial power, any supremacist state. It reminds me of Vietnam in the United States, where Black Americans were disproportionately deployed to fight this unjust war in Vietnam. And so I when you think about Russia, as opposed to, let's say, Black people or the Latinx community, they have Buryats, right? They have Chechen, and they have people from the Caucasus who they disproportionately target and abuse and discriminate against. And when they're not discriminated against them, then they're examples where, per the Moscow Times, they're disproportionately mobilized because they have the least power, the least financial resources to pay off a lawyer or to bribe someone out of service. And so you have these people who are extremely vulnerable, not because they lack an IQ, but because they have been oppressed within that Russian supremacist system over the decades and over the centuries. In their land, like the Native Americans here, were what was raised, was taken, and then before that, they were massacred and they were killed. And so, when the way that I explain it is that just as the indigenous peoples here, the American Indian was brutalized and was killed and was wiped out almost out of existence. Russians had a similar history with its own indigenous people. And so when you break it down that way, then people will begin to understand Russian supremacy and how it works. And in America, people have not gone through the pedagogy an education of an education like I have or you have, Jonathan. What they need are parallels to where they can relate experiences. And so that's what I do. It's really, I think that people run away from race because, and that's one critique that I received over the years by certain people. They say that I take my American concept of race and I apply it to Russia. No, I take Russia's idea of race and I apply it to Russia. The problem is that we don't speak through it through that lens because the peoples who are experiencing that are not centered in the Western discourse. If you speak to, there are plenty of voices out of Kazakhstan, name your Central Asian country, from the southern regions of Russia, who can speak to that experience. But those are not the people who are invited on to discuss these issues on CNN or MSNBC, because they've been not only disenfranchised in their own country, they're disenfranchised in the academy. They're disenfranchised in the think tank community. They're disenfranchised in other areas. And the only places where they really have a voice is on social media. And it's been through social media where they've been able to highlight their challenges, to highlight their grievances, to highlight the supremacy that they're experiencing. And it's really through the power of digital media where we get to hear these medias, because otherwise we get to hear these narratives, because otherwise we never would really hear the extent of how brutal and racist the Russian supremacist nation is that we know as the Russian Federation.
And, a very interesting story came out just earlier this week by a non-ethnic Russian reporter for the Moscow Times saying that 172 representative organizations, various ethnicities within Russia, and this isn't just political, this is cultural, linguistic organizations, they've been labeled as terrorist entities. And I think this tells you everything you need to know. You can exist as a non-Russian ethnicity, but if you try to exercise your agency, if you try to organize or express your identity, you're now seen as a terrorist. Um, it's incredibly extreme, and it's now there. It's no longer hiding in plain sight. It's right out there for everyone to see. Why is this not perhaps better understood, certainly by mainstream media?
Because mainstream media, let's be clear, the default when we talk about mainstream media is Western mainstream media. So let's be clear about that. In mainstream media, when you think about who is the foreign correspondent, the foreign correspondent in 90% of the cases, at minimum, are white men. And they are white men from Washington. Their organizations are media organizations are based in Washington, in New York, and in London. And they all come from countries where they have the privilege of not having to confront their own privilege as white men. And they come from countries that have not reconciled their own colonial pasts. And so, how can people who are not trained or conditioned to deal with the colonial pasts of their respective countries, or to deal with the privilege of whiteness, or have never been challenged to interrogate it, how are these people expected to interrogate the supremacist nature of other peoples? Now, what we do see is this very lopsided view towards, Russia, right? They could talk about the brutality of Russia, et cetera, but it doesn't go to the surface of imperialism and colonialism because they've never really had to undergo that pedagogy. And a lot of this reporting isn't just professional. You have to be reflective. And you have to have the type of mind that goes beyond the traditional political frameworks that mainstream media typically does. And so mainstream media does not have the right personalities in place to really delve into the cultural dynamics of why Russia would list, 170 plus people as terrorists. And I know this because as a Black person in this country, you have organizations like the Black Panthers, you have organizations like BLM that in certain instances have been associated with terrorism. And so we understand what it's like to be mislabeled simply because you're seeking your liberation. And so much of telling this story properly is not even education. It comes from the experience of the person. And that's why diversity and DEI, which Donald Trump has vowed to destroy, is so important because you can be the most brilliant mind when it comes to understanding history and the politics, just this one particular thing. But when it comes down to understanding why Russia would make this choice with these indigenous groups, that comes from experience. I don't care what Ivy League school you graduated from. If you can't relate to that, you're not going to get it. You just aren't. And that doesn't mean you're a bad person. It just means that we need to diversify the ranks of journalists who can do it. But it's hard to do that when, even when you're an American or you're from Britain or any other country in Europe, for example, and you're white, you're not taught to confront this issue with yourself. And so that has a lot to do with it. And until we deal with those subjects, then we're not going to find reliable media coverage that really delves into the ills of why Russia is so aggressively going after indigenous peoples. And even in Crimea, for example, they have been going on a nonstop campaign of erasing the Crimean Tatar, their language, their culture, their history, their identity. And so what Russia is doing in this instance with these 172 peoples is just part of course for a for a Russian supremacist um, uh, um, 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 colonial project.
And this brings together quite a few things which I've sort of struggled to understand what's going on here. And it's coalesced into an idea which quite a few people I've spoken to really struggle to understand this. And that is you speak about these sort of, inherent biases that exist in the media because of people's lived experience or lack of certain lived experience. This really seems to trickle down into geopolitical thinking as well. And I've noticed this speaking to a lot of Ukrainians and looking at the way Ukraine has been treated over the last 3 years by US foreign policy. Russia seems to me is treated like a first tier adversary. Whether you like what they do or not, they immediately get attention, whether it's, the Russian regime or its actions or the so-called Russian opposition, such as Yulia Navalny. They are treated as first tier voices, perhaps because they come from a similar imperial that they have an imperialist tone. I mean, you speak Russian, you'll know that there's a certain imperative in the way that Russians speak Russian. The way Ukrainians speak Russian is far softer and less commanding. But Ukraine seems to be treated like a second tier ally. And once you start sort of getting your head around this, you can't unsee it because in foreign policy action and the way the media treats Ukrainians, in the way Ukrainians even are treated in academia, you start to see this almost, I would call it, imperial bias towards Russian voices. Whereas Maidan may be the most extraordinary outflowing of political agency that has happened since the Prague Spring or even the Russian Revolution itself. And yet, how much do you hear about that in the Western media? I would say very little compared to the coverage of Putin's tyranny.
Yeah. So one of the things that people can't wrap their head around is that at the end of the day, Russia and the United States and much of Europe, particularly Western Europe, they're peers. They are imperial colonial peers. when I say this, people say that I'm comparing Russian tyranny to that, and I'm comparing the tyranny of Russia to the spirit of the United States, to the spirit of much of Europe. And you know what? I am. And the reason why I'm doing this is that even though the United States, and this is my personal view, um, you know, generally speaking, America, um, for a lot of people, is not a liberator. It's long been a colonizer. It's a country that's considered to be an aider and abetter of genocide when you think about what's happening in Gaza. Um, the rest of Europe, with its own colonial history, has yet to pay reparations to the continents that it has colonized, right? And so you're dealing with nations that at certain periods of time, whether it's the present, whether it's the past, that have not reconciled the evil that they have inflicted upon people. And so, even though I am a big advocate of America supporting Ukraine and sending arms and etc., um, I entered this conversation with a more nuanced appreciation of my country because I can't speak about Ukraine as some typical think tank person who tells you the different conversations about democracy and this, that, and the third, when my people in this country's 250 plus history, if we're looking at 1776 at the beginning, my people, for most of their lives, did not experience democracy. Okay. My people did not experience democracy up until about 1970. What little of democracy that we do have. And so even the frameworks that I approach this question that you're asking about Navalny, I bring that into consideration because just like the Americans that Navalny is engaging, they all lack self-reflection. So the question really should be, are the people who are really, and I have my own critiques about Navalny. I think that she is not really, I never trusted Alexei Navalny. May he rest in peace. That should not have happened to him. He should not have been what I believe to be killed and murdered by the Russian state. But do I think that he was somebody who really was an anti-imperial opposition leader? Absolutely not. Do I think that Navalny is any better than her late husband, who should not have died or been killed? Absolutely not. I think that she has a very chauvinistic, very pompous, arrogant, imperial mindset against Ukraine, just like her husband, and much of the Russian opposition. But in order for us to really understand your question and why Navalny is considered like this top tier person and Ukraine is the second, is that America has always done this, has always positioned the oppressor, i.e., white people, and put people like us as Black people, the second tier people, at the bottom or beneath that. And so, I'm entering into this conversation, I think about 2014 when the war in Ukraine broke out for the first time, or the annexation of Donbass, Luhansk, and Crimea. And then a few months later, you had the uprisings in Ferguson. And so during this 1 year, and roughly about eight months apart from each other, you had these ideas, right, where black people and Ukrainians were seeking their liberty and fighting back and pushing back against, the tyrannies in their own country with the Maidan, right, and then with the uprisings in Ferguson, and they used social media to amplify their voices. And and this is important to your question, because it was really the first time where Black people were really able to display from a communication standpoint, their agency in ways that they had not done before. And so they had to be respected in real life, whether the power structures wanted to or not. And so I feel like the same fight that Ukrainians are waging against Russia, and they're pushing back against this narrative that Navalny is going to be the savior of Russia that America and the West can rely upon. I think that there's also this narrative that the Ukrainians are pushing back against the West to even decolonize their own mind. And because they can't decolonize their own minds, they can't enter into a healthy critique of Navalny because in many respects, Navalny is them, if that makes sense.
It does, it does. And unfortunately, Russia seems to know us better than we know ourselves in some instances because its propaganda plays on this understanding that there is a lot of unreconstructed racism, and there is unconscious racism, and there is a fear of sort of opening that Pandora's box of re-examining the past. Their propaganda plays on it by talking about these traditional Russian values. And they've found that they can make connections with the alt-right, the far right, the evangelical right in the US, and those who proclaim themselves conservatives, but actually are now far more in the guise of sort of populists. It's incredibly dangerous, isn't it, that our inherent weaknesses are something that Russia is acutely conscious of and is now leveraging to their benefit.
Well, excuse me. The thing about Russia and their ability to manipulate internal American racism is something that they've been experimenting with for decades, and you can go back to the even before the civil rights era, back in the 1930s, the Russians were able to successfully wage effective information campaigns, disinformation campaigns against towards the continent of Africa by exploiting the ongoing European colonialism that was taking place on the continent. Now, I'm mindful when I say disinformation because part of disinformation involves a lot of truth. And the truth of the matter is that the Europeans were definitely the colonial power of the 1920s, 1930s, much of the 19th, 20th century. Now, Russia, as the Soviet Union, was a colonial power, ironically. The difference was that the Russians were not Africa's colonizer. Now, they tried, but that's a whole nother conversation. But they try, again, that's another conversation. We can talk about that another time because it's a whole thing. But basically, um, because Africa, the continent, was looking for a partner that would not abuse them, Russia was the best alternative. And so Russia became the better partner by virtue of the fact that they were not Africa's colonizer. It's not particularly complex beyond that. Now, another thing is Russia targeted Black Americans as well. There's a smaller number of Black people who were pulled into the Soviet Union out of the United States. And there are a few Black men who wrote autobiographies about this. One guy's name is Homer Smith. He was a journalist who worked for a number of years inside of Moscow. Then there's Robert Robinson, who it was an engineer, Jamaican born, but primarily lived in Detroit. And he was recruited to be an engineer in Moscow. And part of the reason why Robert Robinson was lured was because he worked at Ford. And because of racism back at the companies, he could never really ascend into management and to become an engineer. Whereas in Russia, they brought him to Moscow. He earned his degree. He learned to speak Russian fluently, and he became an engineer. Now, the catch to that with Robert Robinson was that they used him as a propaganda tool and abused him over several decades to the point where he found it unbearable and he fled the Soviet Union. And that's a true story. Robert Robinson, and he's an engineer. He wrote a book about that. Just look it up. And Homer Smith, he went to Russia and I believe it was around 1930, he went because he wanted to be a journalist, but he knew that in the United States, he could not ascend to the level of a foreign correspondent as some of the traditional networks. Whereas in Russia, he went and started off as a postal, as worked at a post office for a year or so. And then he started becoming a freelancer for a lot of the Black press and other publications. And that's how he became a foreign correspondent. But what the Soviets did was that they tapped into the very real racism that America was inflicting on Black people. They also were able to recruit a small number of Black people to be agricultural workers who graduated from the historical Black colleges and universities. And I know this because I'm a historically Black college graduate myself. I graduated from Philander Smith in Little Rock, Arkansas. And so the Soviet Union has this history of recruiting Black people and saying that you can come here and we can promise you you will work in your chosen profession and we won't lynch you. Now, we'll exploit you for our propaganda purposes. And if you can handle that, and if we choose you and you endure it, that's fine. And if you're lucky, during the 1930s, we're going to purge everyone because Stalin did purge a number of Black people. If you're lucky to survive all that, welcome. So the Soviets, the Soviets were very effective in taking America's and Europe's white supremacy, using it against them, and creating a very effective narrative that works to this day for the very simple reason because the Soviet Union was not the Black oppressor, but they were the oppressor of everyone else. And see, that's the issue. And that's where the work that we do is important. Just because the Soviet Union has not historically oppressed Black people, it doesn't mean that they don't exploit our pain for their own political purposes. It does not mean that they don't exploit everyone else. And so this moral, this moral fidelity that we assign to Russia when it comes to pushing back against support against NATO is unfounded. Because they may not be lobbing bombs at us, but they're lobbing bombs at Ukrainians, committing genocide against them. And the question is that morally correct? And if you're someone who believes in moral consistency, then you would not only be against that, you would also support Ukraine's right to defend itself. No more than you would support Russia to support or to build partnerships with South Africa, which is doing in other places, right? So if we're being morally consistent, that's going to require us to have uncomfortable conversations, not only about the Russian propaganda that has been pushed on. It's going to require some people to be uncomfortable to believe that just because they believe that they're against Western imperialism, it doesn't mean that their minds have not been co-opted by Russian imperialism either.
I like that impression there of Stalinism as a equal opportunity oppressor. Everyone's gonna
Yeah.
come under that. But of course, if you survive all that propaganda, you also have to survive the toxic bath of racism that you might experience as a person of color on the Moscow metro, for instance, in shops, in streets. And I don't think you lived in Moscow, but if you spent any time there, would find that the level of sort of background radiation of racism is kind of fairly intense. The last question we have time for, and I have a million other questions, so I definitely like to schedule another conversation because there's so many angles we could go in. Let's turn to the elections of 2016 and 2024 in the US. If the election of 2016 was very much defined by conversations about how far Russian disinformation had penetrated the US system, it seems to me the conversation we're not yet having about 2024 is on a different level. That is how far political technology has been exported into the US system. I think Russia's gone from weaponizing information to actually weaponizing partisan divisions within the US to the point where it starts to resemble aspects of the state capture that we saw under Yanukovych, state capture that we're currently seeing playing out in Georgia. And of course, we can see that in Moldova and Romania, the same kind of processes, the export of Russian authoritarian technology is being put into practice. Are you in a better position, perhaps, to see this process because of your experience in Ukraine and so on? Plus, not necessarily being part of the Washington establishment, who will perhaps seek to, normalize the very abnormal situation that we find ourselves in.
Yeah, and here's the bottom line to that question. The reason why, I think a lot of people don't view American democracy, or let me rephrase it. I think when we look at 2016 in this current election, we realize that our democracy is very vulnerable. And in many respects, we have some of the same vulnerabilities as the emerging democracies in Georgia, um, the type of democracy that we saw under Viktor Yanukovych. And by the way, because I did go to Georgia to cover that election, by the way, I was there. Um, America is a developing nation. America is a developing nation. Political scientists usually focus on countries like Georgia, like Armenia, these former Soviet Union states, Romania as developing countries because their democracies only came to being in 1991. But in reality, our democracy, for what we know it as it is right now, only came into being around 1970. Because as I said before, during the 1960s, I Have a Dream, Martin Luther King was just the man that everyone knows. Those people did not experience democracy. Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., on the day that he was assassinated, did not experience the type of democracy that I'm enjoying today, and for which he shed his blood. Think about that, because with the various nights, like the civil rights acts of throughout the 60s, last one in 19, I believe it was 1968, you had the Voter Rights Act. Before that, it usually takes a few years for those acts to really be implemented and put into place. So you could pretty much pinpoint around 1970. So 1991 for former communist states, Soviet Union, Warsaw Pact, and then you have for us around 1970. And so our democracy is not as old as we think it is. And so you're going to always have these shifts where Trump can win in 2016 and Biden wins in 2020, and then Trump can win again. We're very vulnerable. And a lot of the white supremacy, that has dominated our society since its beginning, in many respects, still persists to this day. And when you talk about state capture, that's another term that political scientists tend to assign to those other third world countries or developing nations. But Donald Trump, during his first term, turned the White House into a kleptocracy. His son, Jared Kushner, the money that he was able to generate, the billions of dollars, came through his family connections, came through a kleptocratic practice. Donald Trump is an authoritarian leader in his politics, but he can't completely operate that way because we do have institutions through our judicial system that won't allow him to go rogue. But he's an authoritarian leader in the same lens as Orban. He has the same type of racial superiority dynamics as Le Pen in France. He has the same vision of the for America as alternative for Deutschland does, because we know that their country, their government collapsed, and Lord knows who's going to take over, in the upcoming snap elections. So America is still developing too. And we think that we have this superiority in our democracy and the way of thinking over Ukraine, over Georgia, and elsewhere, but we don't. And if you don't understand what I'm saying or agree with me, you don't have eyes. Okay. In this country, before I was a foreign correspondent, I did coverage of national elections across the South mainly. There are various voter ID laws that actively discourage people from voting. And what does that look like? That means that back in 2000, I believe it's 2011, the Supreme Court struck down a rule in which states had to report to the Department of Justice to change local laws. And so the reason why this rule was intact was because of the racism of many of these southern states. There were northern states as well, but particularly these southern states, former slaveholding states, would actually enact to oppress Black voter turnout. The Supreme Court in the early 2010s struck a provision in the Voter Rights Act so that states don't have to seek permission to change their local laws. And so now you have places like Georgia where it's illegal for an organization to hand out water to people waiting in line to vote. There are, in across the South, you have situations where in smaller towns, polling stations are closed, and it forces these people to travel miles and miles on end to find another place to vote. This is happening in the most powerful democracy on earth. And so, can we really say that this is a dominating, full-fledged democracy? Absolutely not. Now, if you do think that, then my question would be, who are you and what's your skin color and where do you live, right? Because again, my people did not experience democracy until 1970. The Ukrainians did not experience democracy really until after 1991. So we're all in the same boat together. But until American political scientists humble themselves and get beyond the white context of understanding this country, then we're going to be thumbing. Then everything else that's happening is going to confuse us, and we're going to look at and Ukrainians are going to be confused about us as well, which is another tragic point because they're going to think we thought America was better than this. And my job as that Black dude that writes about Ukraine and reports from Ukraine, I'm here to tell them that the curriculum that you've been studying is wrong. And I'm here to course correct.
And Ukrainians have an important role in adding to that understanding of democratic agency and process. They are not the student, they can be the teacher in many instances. That's what this channel
In more ways
fundamentally
than
hopes.
us, in better ways
Yeah.
than us. And they can teach us more. That's the whole thing. I'm sorry, I just had to say there are many more things that Ukrainians, just as many things that Ukrainians could teach us about democracy than Americans about them. And more specifically, I think that Americans, Black Americans, we get what's happening in Ukraine. In my conversation with Black people and the various dialogues and groups, we understand Ukraine better because we have that shared history of oppression and we don't smell ourselves like too many of our non-Black counterparts. I'm sorry, just had to add that in.
No, that's really important to say. And I think that will launch us into the next conversation, which hopefully we'll have soon. I got through about a third of my questions, so there's plenty more to discuss the next time. But I'm
We got to
hugely
talk about,
appreciative. I'm hugely
yeah, we got to talk about
appreciative.
Africa. Yeah.
Yeah.
I'm hugely appreciative too, and I'm thankful for the work that you're doing, that you've been ongoing. We need more people like you, and we need to really dialogue with each other about how we can build constructive dialogues that go beyond our echo chamber, so that people can understand. I'm definitely taking this interview and I'm cutting it up, putting it on Instagram, etc., and going into 2025, and facilitating these dialogues so that we can expand our reach because we get it and we have the right mindset for it. But so many people who are not in our circles need it, and we need to expand. I'm looking forward to doing that with you.
I very much look forward to that. It's fantastic. That's music to my ears. For today, though, I'm hugely appreciative of you coming onto the channel, hugely appreciative of the work you do. We'll put all the links in the description. Thank you, Terrell, so much. It's been a huge honor and a pleasure speaking.
Absolutely.